Hello, my name is Todd Shannon. I'm a data scientist, social commentator, and getter of buckets. I will also dunk on you if I catch you slipping. And this is the Who Cares What Todd Thinks vlog, but we're not here to talk about basketball today. So then what are we talking about? We are going to talk about hypocrisy, subtitled the Southside episode. Now, we should call this actually the Southside series because this is going to take a while to unpack. Now, I said Southside episode. I'm not sure what I'm going to call this. I actually think of these guys as brothers who love the Lord but have serious blind spots. So, therefore, I'm actually going to call this the Southside Blind Guides series. Say blind guides. That's a little spicy. That's a little pejorative. See, I'm actually really excited about doing this and also have great trepidation. One is because it's a great opportunity for me to provide some clarity on a much needed subject. Much needed clarity on these subjects. And also, I just like to expound. As I say in my little intro, I am a social commentator, and I feel like I have something to offer to this conversation. But I have some trepidation because these brothers I really respect. I like especially KB, Ameen, to be quite frank, I don't really know much about him. I only know about him in the context of him doing these types of conversations with KB. But obviously, we know KB has been Christian hip-hop extraordinaire from, since way back. He's been putting out hits that we all like to rock to. My kids love KB. I love KB. One of the few Christian rappers, to be quite frank, I can still even listen to and feel like I get anything out of it. But that's another subject for another day. We are talking today about hypocrisy. And we're going to use the Southside Blind Guides. The Southside Rabbis. I shouldn't. Listen, first of all, let me say this. This is not name calling, okay? It's a descriptor. I believe these brothers have blind spots. Okay, so if I slip up and say the Southside Blind Guides, I'm not trying to name call. It's not me clowning. These are serious issues. There's no clowning going on over here. There's no jokes over here. I call them that, like I say, because there are some things that I'm going to show you that hopefully if KB and Ameen watch these videos, they'll open up to their blind spots. Maybe they'll give us better content when they do commentary on these subjects. And most of all, I want us to be edified. I want you to be able to listen to people and understand what you're listening for. And if you have a disagreement, if you have this little kind of dull ache deep down inside and something's not quite right, but you can't put your finger on it, maybe these episodes will help you kind of parse those things out, the things that you're missing. Now, politics is obviously an issue that many of us divide over. It's very divisive. The reason why it's so divisive or we can divide over them is because these issues are really important. They're not like, it's not like who's the GOAT in basketball conversation, LeBron or Jordan. Well, it's obviously Jordan, but even if you do have it wrong and you think it's LeBron, we don't divide over those kinds of conversations and disagreements. Why? Because that stuff doesn't matter, right? Politics does matter. These things have a very significant impact on people's lives. And so when we disagree about them, it gives an occasion for lots of friction and things that cause us to want to separate. But I want to present to you that it's not really the disagreements that cause us to separate. It's not really the fact that we can't see things eye to eye that causes us to kind of break camp and to go to our separate corners. What really is at issue is when we don't have respect for the other side. Now, there's some things in particular that can erode respect in the other side's opinion, and that's what we are going to talk about today. It's that H word, the hypocrisy. Now, let's start with Matthew 7. Matthew 7 is one of my favorite texts. It's almost impossible to overestimate the the vast array of applications that we can derive from Matthew 7. Every time you read Matthew 7, every time you come up into a new part of your life that you would think Matthew 7 might have a little to no impact on, or little to nothing to say about it, I constantly find myself finding new utility in Matthew 7. What's Matthew 7? It's a really, people use it often to talk about don't judge me and you shouldn't judge people. The Bible says don't judge. Almost all the time people say that, they're using it wrong. The Bible doesn't say don't judge. It just gives you a template on if you're going to judge, you should understand that these are the parameters. But I want to take it a step above that. I think we're getting down into the weeds when we talk about judging and how you judge and if you judge. What Matthew 7 really is about is a template on how to engage with people with whom you disagree. You might not have thought about that. You might have think about other passages in the Bible where Jesus said, "Hey, if you have an ought against your brother, and go to your brother alone and tell it to him. If your brother sins against you, tell it to him. And if he listens to you, then you've won your brother, yada, yada." We know that whole thing. And if they don't listen, then you escalate it. You go tell the church. If they don't listen to the church, then you might have to put that brother outside of the fellowship. We think about a template for engagement on disagreements. We think of it on those terms often, but really, I think an even more practical example is the one we see in Matthew 7, where the first thing he says is, "Judge not that you be not judged." But then he says, if you see your brother's got a little speck in his eye, you know what you should do? You should go and get the speck. No, not the speck. Get the 2x4 off the side of your face so that you can see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. You see, it's a template on how to go and tell someone if you think that they're wrong. If you're going to get the speck out of your brother's eye, make sure you don't have a beam in your own. And I find that oftentimes when people do not judge rightly and they're going to go tell somebody that they should fix something about their life and about their attitude, and they're not quite right about it, it's almost always because they are doing the same thing, but they've got that problem that they're trying to point out in the other person like times 10 going on in their own life. You see, this is the thing that erodes respect. And so I'm taking quite a bit of time in developing this idea because I want you to understand that this is why I have come to call these guys' episodes regarding these issues the Southside Blind Guides, because I think that this describes them. Disagreements we can deal with. Respect and the lack thereof when you feel someone is being dishonest, or if they have a double standard, or if they're being hypocritical, that is where the communication breaks down, and that's what we can't get over. Okay, so now that I took that long, convoluted path to get to this point, now let's talk about these issues, and let's present some receipts, because I'm talking about hypocrisy and double standards, and obviously, if that's the way I feel, then I need to be able to produce some of those. So let's start with the central tendency and really the kind of the main topic of most of KB and Ameen's podcasts, which is race and racism. Okay, so they delve off into politics, obviously, but they really talk about that in the context of how it plays out in race most often. So let's talk about their ideas about racism. And one of the things that I gather about what they tend to communicate, and by the way, I've listened to pretty much everything in their second season. So they had 2 seasons of the Southside Rabbi. The first season was not so much political stuff. I didn't really listen to much of that, but I listened to the entire second season. So I think I've got my bases covered here. So when I say I gather that they always want to seem to project that the responsibility and all of the racism comes from white people, right? White people have not only the responsibility to combat racism, but generally speaking, racism, if it's present, is almost always coming from their direction. If they don't think that, if they believe something otherwise, I'm certainly not aware of it. They certainly haven't made that clear or plain through their talks on their podcast. So if you feel like, or if anyone feels like I'm mischaracterizing them because maybe you know them personally or because you heard them say something in another place that would contradict what I'm saying, hey, I'm not saying that that's not possible. I'm not saying that that's not necessarily the case. All I'm saying is, from what I've gathered from their podcast, they certainly don't give that impression. And this is one particular clip that I think is instructive when they say, well, if you don't think that you need help detecting your racism, then that's just arrogant. And so they go, well, we can help you understand if you don't believe that you're racist, we can point it out. Trust us. Even if you feel like you aren't, if we say that you are, then you should feel that you are. And if you resist us, then you're being arrogant. It's kind of an interesting and weird take, but let's listen to them so you can hear it from their own mouths.
Facts. So you're telling me that there are other sins that you would not know that you're committing that the body would be able to see and bring to your attention, but racism is the only sin that you will always be able to know and tell that you're committing without somebody else telling you that you are. It's arrogance.
It is arrogance, and I think it also undermines how the Bible talks about sin.
Right.
Sin is almost always seen as a glacier, right?
Yes.
You can see how it rears its head
right,
over the surface.
Yeah.
But there's always something deeper that's rooted in your heart.
Right.
Now, what he just said about it being deeper and being rooted in your heart, I 100% agree, right? The idea, though, that if you do not accept KB and Ameen's and those who think like him personal definition of what racism looks like and what it is and how it's manifesting in your life, then you're arrogant. Now, to give you an idea of the sort of thing that I'm talking about, it's really interesting for me because in their podcast, and this is a theme that we will revisit because it's a very prominent thing and something that's a little bit frustrating for someone who I kind of know what they're talking about, but they always talk in these vague terms so that we don't have an actual concrete example. Like, for example, they talk about this kind of nebulous, kind of ever-present racism. It's just kind of out there in the ether, and they don't actually kind of accuse anyone in particular of being racist. They just say, well, white people in general, I think you kind of know that you are, and they kind of give kind of hints and overtures to the fact that, maybe the white evangelical Trump supporting a churchgoer is probably racist, but they don't say that explicitly. But in any case, they don't give a lot of specific examples of what they think racism is, or when someone was expressing racism. Well, there's one example that I can think of. I won't play it because, maybe some of you know about it, but there was an incident about a year ago, no, maybe not a year ago, maybe not quite that long ago, but maybe last summer, where Lecrae and Louis Giglio and Dan Cathy, the owner of Chick-fil-A, kind of sat down and talked, and they talked about race and race issues. And there was a big to-do where, Louis Giglio says something like, they were discussing the concept of white privilege. And he didn't want to call it white privilege because some people have an issue with that, a legitimate issue with that. And here's one kind of example of where you have these people on the woke side of the tracks where they want to try to push this thing on you, and they want to say, white people have white privilege, and if you don't acknowledge that, then that's racism. So there's one example of the sort of thing they try to constantly push on you. Now, there again, they don't talk in these terms specifically in their podcast, but I get the kind of the general idea that they kind of agree with that sort of thing. Although I could be wrong. If they want to correct me, I'm happy to be corrected. But where it really got interesting, where Louis Giglio and Dan Cathy and Lecrae were having this conversation, where Louis Giglio tries to avoid this term white privilege, and so he uses the term white blessing. Now, he was actually, if you really look at it in context, and if you understand what he was saying, he was actually trying, poorly, might I add, but he was trying to give really kind of an olive branch. He was trying to validate in some way the idea that white people have enjoyed, particularly in the past, a social status and benefits that black people historically had not. And so he was trying to give credence to that idea, but he didn't want to use the term because he was trying to be respectful of white people who could be offended by it. Now, this is really interesting because we do that all the time, especially when it comes to the woke mob. It doesn't matter what your intentions are. If you use a term or if you say anything that they think is offensive, it doesn't matter if you didn't mean it that way. They want to have you tarred and feathered. And so when Louis Giglio tries to do that for the people on the other side of the aisle that maybe have a difficulty accepting this idea that they have white privilege, maybe they had a hard life, maybe they came up with a lot of difficulties, maybe all of this white privilege that they so-called have over black people, they kind of resent the fact that somebody's telling them that their life was easy and they didn't have a lot of problems, or that they had it better than all the black people, when that's not necessarily true. But anyway, it didn't really matter what he meant. It didn't really matter what he was trying to do. The only thing that mattered is that Lecrae and other people were offended. And so this is what I'm talking about. Here he gets accused of, basically the only reason why you didn't even want to call it white privilege is because you got white privilege, and it became a big stink, right? And this is the sort of thing that they think is racism. It doesn't matter what your intent is. And you say, well, where do you get that from? Why do you say that? Well, they explicitly say that intention doesn't matter. Here's another clip.
So, but either way, it's this arrogance and pride. And not only that, it's a misunderstanding of how racism works. Because racism, the reason that people could say, I know that if I was committing racism, I know if I was being a racist, I would know, is because you believe that racism is about intent.
That's right.
Racism exclusively about intent. I have to wake up in the morning and say, I hate black people.
Right.
Or I think black people are inherently stupid or dumb or inferior or all of that. And
so there you see it. They see it out of their own mouths. Ameen says it, KB nodding in agreement. It's not about intent. Right? It's not about intent. Well, that's interesting because, when I read the Bible, I see that sin is mostly about intent. It's really interesting that, for example, let's see if I were to turn the tides on KB and Ameen, because in all of the content that I've listened to, I've heard them say several things that aren't true, and I have receipts for that. We will get to it, don't worry. But they've said some things that aren't true. So here's the issue with that. Can we apply this same standard to KB and Ameen? If they say something that isn't true, is it fair for me to say that they lied? How does that work? You see, whenever you remove intent and you start applying this arbitrary definition to things that you personally find offensive, or you want to change and elevate and kind of come to a non-biblical standard, to be quite frank, of how you accuse people and how you attack their character, and then you wonder why they aren't receptive to what you're saying, right? You say it doesn't even matter if you meant to be. We just, if we feel impacted in some way, like, for example, Louis Giglio saying that it was white blessings instead of white privilege, then we feel offended. And whatever, you microaggressed me. So let's point that high-powered perception back at you. Let's use the same standard that you use to judge others. Let's use that to judge you, because that's what Matthew 7 says, by the way, right? It says the same standard you use to judge others will be measured back to you. And that's why Matthew 7 is an important cog in this wheel as we explore these subjects. You said something that wasn't true. It doesn't matter if you intended to deceive. You're a liar. Just like if somebody says or does something that you find offensive, if you say, well, I know that they didn't mean to be racist and that wasn't their intent, and maybe it was a matter of how I perceived it, maybe it's a heart issue on my end, that doesn't matter. You want to call them a racist. Okay, so if that's the way we're playing the game, then let's play it that way, right? Intent doesn't matter. All that matters is that your supposed impact. But you see, this is why this is nonsense. I don't have to call KB and Ameen a liar to say that something that they said wasn't true. Maybe somebody says something that was insensitive. Cultural things, sometimes they bubble up. And like, for example, I've heard things like if you go to another country and they've put some food in front of you and you eat it and then they offer you seconds, if you refuse, some people take offense to that, right? Does that mean you're inherently rude? It's like, no, well, maybe you just didn't understand a cultural norm that would be obvious to someone else, but maybe wasn't obvious to you if you're an outsider. So we don't give each other that grace, though. We're so bent on finding racism, whether it's obviously there or not, that we just go off on a tangent and say, well, intent doesn't matter. I'm sorry, but intent does matter quite a bit, actually. So these are the sorts of things when it comes to race and racism that I have difficulty with, because it doesn't mean that someone's racist and arrogant, like you say, if they don't accept your assessment of their supposed racism. It just means that they don't accept your arbitrary and sometimes, quite frankly, bullcrap definition of racism. Right? So, I want to give an example of this on the other side because I think this is important. Because, once again, underlying this is not only kind of unbiblical, kind of arbitrary definitions of racism, based totally on the subjective feelings of people like KB and Ameen who think racism is ubiquitous and everywhere always, but it's always going in one direction, right? It's always the white people that have the problem, right? So let me give you a little glimpse into a conversation that I had when I was talking to some brothers of mine. When I say brothers, I mean they were like brothers, like black brothers, and brothers in the Lord. These are all Christian guys, right? People who are in the faith. And listen to this exchange that I had with my brother, and I want you to see if you pick up on something.
That happens in our world that portrays black men in a certain way. For me to think for 1 second that white parents, not saying they all, I'm not broad stroking, that white parents in some cases don't prepare their children to deal with the thug, right? Which, for lack of better phrases in our society, is portrayed as a black.
If I can jump in, so two things. One is, so are you saying that you think that it's okay that white people teach their kids about the black thug or something?
No, I'm not saying it's okay because it's not my place to say if it's okay or not okay. But I'm saying that because it could happen, I have to prepare my children that it is happening. For that it is happening, most specifically, right? It would be like when you use the dog analogy, right? And David did a great job of explaining the opposite end of that. If I don't tell my child that dog has the capability of biting, then, you know what I'm saying? I feel like I'm ill preparing them for what could possibly happen. Not saying it will, but for what could possibly happen because the dog has fangs and the ability to bite.
Right. So, so the question that I'm asking is that, you're saying that it's not your place. I think it is your place. I think this is what this forum is about.
Okay.
Do you think that it's wrong for a white man to caution his son or daughter about the black guy? You gotta watch out for the black guy. That might be more likely.
I'm going to say what I said again. I'm going to stand on that because, for one, I don't agree that it is this platform's job to say whether they should or shouldn't. It's not my position.
Well, I'm asking what's your opinion.
In my opinion, that if they do, I'm assuming that they do. I'm saying that
right.
So Ty,
I'm not judging it.
Yeah,
because I'm not judging.
So by that, would I be unreasonable to say that you think that it's okay, or at least you're indifferent about it? So
I never said it was okay. I just said that it's something that I can't control.
So, did you see what just happened there? So just to make sure you have the context, we're having a conversation. This was, by the way, we did this on Facebook Live, so I'm not airing a private conversation for public consumption. This was a public conversation when we had it initially. And the context was this. how do you prepare your children to deal, or maybe to if they experience racism, or how do you prepare your children to live in a world where racism exists, right? So we're talking about that, and we're having this discussion, and so the question comes up, well, well, I got to prepare my kids. I was like, well, yeah, well, we got to prepare our kids, but we really shouldn't be. We shouldn't be like telling our kids, watch out for white people, right? But notice the way I phrased the question, though, because to be quite frank, this should have been like a layup, right? This was like a softball lob right across the plate that I just set up for him to crush out of the park. And I found it interesting that he kind of wouldn't answer the question directly. It's the easiest possible question ever. Should white people, is it okay that if a white parent tells their kid to watch out for those black kids, that's obviously wrong, and my man wouldn't say that it was wrong. Now, let's just keep it 100. What can we infer from that? I think it's pretty obvious. He won't condemn it because he's telling his kids to do it. He says, I'm assuming that the white people are doing it. Therefore, I'm going to tell my kids to watch out for them. I'm assuming white people are telling their kids, watch out for those black kids. So I'm telling my kids, watch out for those white kids. And why do I put this out here like this? It's because, you see, this is one of the reasons why people don't respond well to the woke scold and people who want to always talk about whiteness, and they want to talk about white racism, and they want to pretend like this is a sin and a heart issue that black people are somehow incapable of having. You see, when you have those sort of double standards, when you're always sending the criticism over there and you're not addressing the issue that's right in front of you and very prominent sometimes right in our midst, and we act like black people don't have racism, people don't respect that, right? That's the clear situation where you've got the beam in your eye and you're pointing a speck in somebody else's eye. You're criticizing Louis Giglio because he said white blessing versus white privilege. And then you got conversations like I have and I've had many times where I get a black dude that's clearly teaching this. I mean, what are we supposed to do about that, right? You see, if it's a heart issue, then everyone is capable of it. White people do not have a unique propensity to be racist and to hate people of other races. That is not a unique feature of white people. And when you start talking about this stuff like whiteness and all of this stuff and start basically denigrating a culture from a cultural point of view, and you don't do that to anyone else, people don't respect that. It's not that people don't disagree, or it's not just that they disagree, it's that they don't respect it. And this is why Matthew 7 is so important. The same standard you use to judge other people will be measured back to you. That's what the scriptures say. So, on the race issue, we get a fail because it's always the white people that have the problem. And this is KB and Ameen's first issue. Now, on to the next topic, which I think potentially is the most egregious one, which is there talks about Christian nationalism. Now, they define Christian nationalism pretty loosely. I still, to this day, I don't really know what exactly it is, but roughly, and this is just a rough approximation, and you don't get mad at me that I can't define it, because they don't really define it well, and it's really their term. So I just have to deduce and try to deduct as much as I can and give you what I think they're talking about. But roughly, you can, maybe someone can quibble with this, but it's basically white evangelical Trump supporter who's very patriotic. I don't know, something like that, something to that effect. It seems to me very, very much to be, as all things seem to revolve around, Donald Trump and the support that many Christians tended to have for him. And so now they talk about nationalism as if it's some sort of like substitute for the gospel. This is what they call it. It's another gospel. Now, I do want to say this. They have a whole episode on this, so I'm not going to play a specific clip. If you wanna watch it, I encourage you to do that. But they say it's another gospel, and some of their claims, I will say, that they're not completely vacuous, right? There is this sort of thing out there where there are many people who think that being Christian and being American, being an American patriot is somehow, they go hand in hand. And obviously that's not necessarily the case. But they seem to be really, really focused on the idea that this Christian nationalism is a dangerous force to be reckoned with, and we need to call it out. And people who are mistaking nationalism for Christianity, they need to be called to the carpet and called to repentance even, and to turn to the Lord Jesus Christ for salvation. Well, I think for some of them that's probably the case. But here's the rub. And remember, our theme here of double standards and hypocrisy. On the one hand, they've got, like I said, an entire episode talking about that, nothing but harsh and stern words for those who indulge it, and then they ignore something like this.
Asked Warnock how his support for abortion squares with being a Christian minister.
Oh, I believe that health care is a human right. And I believe that it is something that the richest nation in the world provides for its citizens. And for me, reproductive justice is consistent with my commitment to that.
No, you didn't just hear that incorrectly. Let's just listen just a little bit more.
I believe unequivocally in a woman's right to choose, and that the decision is something that we don't want government engaged in. But that's between her and her doctor and her minister.
Now, let's take a moment to digest what we just heard. Just in case you don't know what you just watched. You just watched a guy named Raphael Warnock. I personally call him Raphael Warlock, because that's spiritually what I think of him. This guy is certainly not a Christian. He calls himself a reverend. Side note, an interesting fact, he pastors, I think, Ebenezer Baptist Church. That's the church that I think Dr. Martin Luther King was a part of. Don't get me started on the orthodoxy of Dr. King. That's a separate issue. Dr. King did great things for civil rights. I appreciate him for that. Some interesting, maybe completely unorthodox Christian views, but that's a side note. Reverend Warnock, Reverend, I put that in scare quotes, says this is what he calls abortion. He calls abortion reproductive justice. I just, in the immortal words of the Shogun of Harlem, Negro, please. You're going to put justice at the end? You're going to append that to abortion? Like, so a woman killing her children is abortion? I can't, I just... And this is what people on the left do. They just append justice to whatever thing that they want to make seem like it's good. It could be the wicked, most, vile thing ever, but they put justice at the end of it. They're just making up new terms that don't exist. There's no reproductive justice. You can't kill your children. There's no justice in that. But here's what I want to point out. This is what's so important about this. It isn't necessarily that they don't have a point pointing out maybe a specific segment of America where they think patriotism and Christianity are somehow synonymous. That's a thing, I think, probably in some circles. I mean, I don't know those people, but they're out there, I'm sure, right? And it could be potentially a problem. But to try to you devote a whole episode to that, and then you act like that's this big problem, and then you get this guy saying this crap, and you got nothing to say. This guy, you saying Christian nationalism is another gospel, and this guy isn't preaching another gospel. You see, this is not a matter of disagreeing. This is a matter of respect. This is a matter of not having such a brazen, unabashed double standard. This is about you straining at a gnat and swallowing a camel. Oh, someone is a little too zealous with their national anthem singing and a little too upset that someone's kneeling in protest before the flag, but you can get a guy who advocates the murder of children calling himself a pastor and you got zero to say about it? I'm sorry. I can't respect that. You see? And just so you understand that this is not a small deal. Lecrae, who is someone, once again, I think Lecrae has a lot of opportunities to be out in the public sphere. You know, I'm not saying that Lecrae and Ameen, KB and Ameen are Lecrae and that they hold all the same views. But Lecrae was out here campaigning for Raphael Warnock's election to the Senate, which he subsequently won. So here you get Christian rapper and obviously one of KB's friends, someone who he worked for and worked with for many, many years, a co-laborer in the same sort of field of doing the hip-hop thing and the rap thing. You got all these tough words for all the white evangelicals and nothing to say to your mans? You see, this is something that I always say. Even if you think people are evil, that doesn't mean that they're stupid. Evil and stupidity are not synonymous, right? They don't have to happen at the same time. They are mutually exclusive. There are evil people who are really smart. There's smart people who are pretty evil. There's smart people who are good. There are evil people who are dumb, right? But if you think that white people and all their whiteness and white fragility and all of their hang-ups and racism, they might have all of that, but they can still sniff out a double standard when they see it. And so can I. I can sniff out a double standard. I can see when your real concern is not necessarily how the gospel is being compromised, so much as it being compromised by people with whom you disagree with politically and using that as an occasion to bolster your own political views and to diminish those of your political opponents. It seems very much like a ploy to vindicate your activism against Donald J. Trump, more so than a real concern for the integrity of the gospel. Because if you were, it's hard for me to understand how you overlook something like Raphael Warnock. It's not a small deal. This is straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel, and that's what Jesus talked about when he talked about that hypocrisy that we just can't tolerate in our midst. We won't even begin to deal with and again, this is for the sake of brevity, I've got all the receipts there. Again, you can go watch their videos. We won't even begin to talk about the whole episode they did on the Capitol riots and how this insurrection, it's more like a riot and like a bunch of morons tearing up some stuff. I don't want to minimize the fact that it was bad. It was certainly bad. But as we've moved further and further away from that event, the original 7 people that they tried to pin, tried to blame the deaths of those 7 people on events from the Capitol riots, it turns out that there's actually only one person who died as a result of the events at the Capitol riots, and that's the young lady, Ashley Babbitt, who was killed by a Capitol police officer. All of the other deaths were completely unrelated, and we know that now. And that is not to diminish it, but she was shot as an unarmed woman, which I've been reliably informed that we're not supposed to do. But I guess because she's white and didn't have the correct, political views, that we don't have to say her name, right? You see, when the hypocrisy gets so bad that it's just so blatant and so out in the open that it's partisan and it's completely, we take on this, this grandstanding about moralism and how the Christians have lost their way, and you overlook stuff like that, and then you expect people to listen to you. You set yourself up as guides, the Southside Rabbis, your teachers. And this is the stuff you overlook. Once again, you got a whole episode on the Capitol riots. Well, all last summer, and I checked, because I wanted to be fair, I've been off of Twitter. I started Twitter like 2014, back when I was doing the Christian rap thing. I feel like everybody and their mom was a Christian. Yes, I did do Christian rap, but I was doing the Twitter thing. I wasn't really into it, never was into Twitter. I got off Twitter. I said, you know what, let me go back on Twitters. KB and Ameen, they seem to be doing their Twitter thing. I went back. I'm looking on their timeline this summer for them having a single solitary word of criticism about the riots in Kenosha, the riots in Minneapolis, the riots in Portland, Oregon, where people were murdered. Not this fake stuff that the media is drumming up, where they try to make it a bigger deal than it was, when in fact that nobody was actually armed. Again, I'm not saying that it was cool. These people were felons. They're going to go to jail, as they should go to jail, for running up in the nation's capital and acting a fool, right? But then they want to pin that on Christians, like there's some overarching theme, like Christians fed that monster, like that had anything to do with Christians. But they got not word one to say about how when the riots were going on in Kenosha and Minneapolis, and people were being killed and businesses were being destroyed, they were saying things like, riots are the voice of the unheard. You see, once again, it's not the disagreement. It's the hypocrisy. Some of these things you might very well have a decent point on, but when it's so brazenly obvious that you overlook the error of those on your political side of the aisle, that's a quick and easy way to break down discussion and to stop communication. So the next thing we're going to talk about is KB's and Ameen's, their warnings and their admonitions to their Christian brothers and sisters about slander. And in particular, their slander with respect to calling other brothers and sisters in the faith Marxists, because according to them, they're only concerned about racial justice, right? So let's listen to KB. Let's listen to him talk about it just a bit.
So
then start. And can I say something real quick? I'm so sorry, brother. I want you to finish your point.
No, go ahead.
But I also think what happens is that it turns Christian brothers into slanderers.
Yeah. Oh, that's what I was
liars.
That's what I was going to get at. Is that when it changes your relationship with the truth and logic, it also turns Christians into people that are bearing false witness against other people.
Like the Marxism thing, which is largely a conspiracy theory,
bro.
Because real quick,
go ahead.
Just real fast, Marxism is problematic.
Yes.
The Church of Jesus Christ in this country, Marxism is now in the top 5 issues faced. I don't know if it's on the top.
Okay, so I want you to note, he said that the Marxism thing is largely a conspiracy. Now, many of you may not quite know about this. This is not probably common knowledge, the whole Marxism claim. So the truth is that there's something called critical race theory. You've probably heard it, even if you don't know what it is. And critical race theory is also known as, or basically derived from, what they call cultural Marxism. Classic Marxism was about economics. It was about the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie, and how the proletariat would rise up and rightfully take their place and overthrow the bourgeois and the capitalists, and because they're being exploited by the capitalists and by these business owners. And so Marxism was this kind of, basically this theory about the struggles for economic power. Well, that largely fell out of favor because people who tried it ended up being poor and killing each other. So it was a really dumb idea, but then they reformulated it into cultural Marxism so that it wasn't so much economic, but it was about power dynamics and classism, and, and that's where you get all this stuff about intersectionality and about the oppressed and the oppressor, what some people call the oppression Olympics, right? Who's most oppressed? Who's lowest on the intersectional totem pole, right? And so without going into all of that, we certainly don't have time to go down that rabbit hole, but basically that there's people who are ultra woke and ultra concerned about racism and finding it everywhere, even sometimes when it's not there, are said to be basically engaging or using a sort of cultural Marxism. And this has been something that many people in the church have said is a problem, right? Those who are orthodox, because critical race theory and Marxism in any form, whether it's economic or cultural, just is not compatible with biblical Christianity. It just runs afoul of many, many basic Christian principles, not the least of which, justice, biblical justice. But he says this whole thing that many people have been pointing out, people like Vodi Bakum, very well respected man of God, many people like Neil Shenvi, and all of this stuff about critical race theory and Marxism, it's just a conspiracy. And if you say that, then you're slandering your brother and sister. There's just one problem with that, KB. Just to properly set this up, this is on KB and Ameen's video about Christian nationalism, where they go on at length, about how God, people who think that God wants to bless America in particular are deceived, and that, God wants to bless every nation, and God doesn't prefer us. And when he says that God doesn't prefer the United States, he makes a statement about who God does prefer. Now, listen.
Sacrifice to unknown gods. Bottom line is this: just because it's your conviction doesn't make it God's conviction.
Right.
He didn't just create America. He created every country,
Absolutely.
every nation. And if you want to talk about who he shows preference to, who is the profile of the preferred by God?
The vulnerable.
The vulnerable, the weak, the broken,
Yes.
the foreigner,
And if you-
those
yep.
who are outside of power, money, and resource and success.
And if you want to...
The plot thickens, my friend. Because now, remember now, we've been reliably informed that to accuse them of Marxism is slander and lying. And then he comes back and he says that. Well, you say, well, what does that have to do with slander and Marxism? You see, for most of you, it went right over your head. But there's a principle. There's a principle in Marxism, or what's also called liberation theology, which is basically the Christian version of Marxism, right? Don't take my word for it. Let's just listen to it.
Book called A Theology of Liberation. Gutierrez himself distinguished between three types of poverty: spiritual poverty, voluntary poverty, and material poverty. So spiritual poverty, or a radical openness to God, is something desirable in Christianity. Voluntary poverty, or the act of detachment from material wealth in solidarity with the poor, is also something desirable. However, the third kind of poverty, material poverty, is always evil. Material poverty involves the privation of goods that are necessary for living a dignified life. Things like food, shelter, clothing, healthcare, education. Liberation theology holds that God always takes the side of those on the margins of society and those subject to material poverty.
Liberation theology says that God always takes the side of those who are poor and on the margins. Now, if I'm not mistaken, that's exactly what KB and Ameen just said. Now, liberation theology is a product of Marxism, 1. And 2, that crap's not in the Bible. Let me give you some receipts.
God is working in history to liberate the poor. So consequently, to follow God means to share in God's preferential option for the poor and to work to eradicate poverty and marginalization. Liberation theology is fundamentally a reflection on praxis, which is to say it's a reflection on our action in the world. And so it follows a threefold structure of seeing, judging, and acting. Seeing involves the perception of unjust structures that perpetuate material poverty. So to that end, many liberation theologians use Marxist or other critical theories in order to make explicit those systems of oppression in every situation that they're analyzing.
What was that, young sir? Could you repeat that?
Use Marxist or other critical theories in order to make explicit those systems of oppression in every situation that they're analyzing. Those theologians use Marxist or other critical theories in order to make explicit those systems of oppression in every situation that they're analyzing.
Okay, so liberation theology use Marxists or critical theories to analyze oppressive structures. So you mean to tell me that KB just quoted a principle from liberation theology, and then he says we are slandering him and others like him when we point out that he's using Marxist ideas to support his theology? My friend, where's the slander coming from? It's not coming from this side, it's coming from you. We're not making this stuff up. I got the receipts. And just in case you were wondering, I'll put the scripture on the screen. The idea that God prefers or has a preferential option for the poor with respect to justice is a lie. It's not in the Bible. Liberation theology has been rejected as an unorthodox, in other words, it's heresy. It is a departure from orthodoxy. It is not the gospel, and there are no mainline denominations, I shouldn't say mainline denominations, but most mainstream Christianity rejects liberation theology as orthodox teaching. There's a reason why you don't teach it, is because it's heresy. Not necessarily because of this specific point, which is certainly error, but if you believed it, it wouldn't necessarily put you outside of the Orthodox faith. They're outside of Orthodoxy because the guy who founded it was a heretic. He didn't really believe in the core doctrines of the faith. But here's the thing. They say that that God prefers, God has a preferential option. He said, what's the profile of the person that God prefers? Oh, the downtrodden and the marginalized. You basically quoted liberation theology almost verbatim, but when you read Leviticus 19, I'll put the scripture on the screen here, it says, you will not pervert justice. You will not be partial to the poor, nor show favoritism to the great, but you will judge your neighbor fairly. Now, when the Bible directly contradicts something you said, and you quote Marxist ideas as a basic pillar of your activism, and when people call that out, for you to say that they're slandering you is in and of itself slander. Now, I said a mouthful. But you see why this doesn't go well? You see why I call them the Southside blind guides? Because this stuff is important. And when you got people out here saying things that are not biblical, holding people to non-biblical standards, holding people to extra-biblical standards of justice, saying people are racist because they don't accept your ideas about racism, saying people are not caring for black and brown people based on this oppression narrative that is shaped by Marxism, for us to call that out and for you to act like we're the ones who are off our rockers, this is why we don't respect what you're saying. This is why we call you the Southside Blind Guys. Well, this is why I call you the Southside Blind Guys. I'm not trying to slander you. I'm not trying to call you names. I'm trying to say that you are wrong, and it's time for you to own it. I've said enough. This is a really long episode. But the thing that I want you to take from this is that it's important that if we're going to criticize people, that we use Matthew 7 as our model. You're going to say someone's doing something wrong? You want to say someone's slandering you? Maybe you should stop slandering. Just because you didn't maybe know that that was a Marxist idea, maybe you read somebody that read somebody that read somebody that read Marx, that read liberation theology, and you didn't know maybe where that phrase came from. It certainly didn't come from the Bible. And please don't get me started where Jesus said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has sent me to preach to the poor, to set at liberty those who are bruised. I'm very familiar with that scripture, and I'm not going to talk about why it doesn't mean what the liberation theologists people say that it means. We'll deal with that another time. But the bottom line is, if you want someone not to slander, maybe you should stop slandering. You want someone to listen to your cries to stop being racist, then maybe you shouldn't assume that all the racism is coming from the white people. You want someone to move away from Christian nationalism because it's a, quote, another gospel, then maybe you should stop voting for and promoting people who call themselves Christians and call the murder of children justice. Maybe when we do those things, maybe when we get those beams and those 2x4s and those big wood stalks out of our eye, maybe we can see clearly to take the speck of dust out of our brother's eye. And maybe we can have a conversation where we can respect each other's opinion even if we disagree. Because double standards and hypocrisy immediately cause people to shut you down and shut you out, as they should, because why should someone listen to a person blinded by their own hypocrisy and double standard? And KB and Ameen, if you ever see this episode, if you ever see my podcast, I hope that you will receive this criticism in the spirit in which it is given. I'll be happy to fly down to Florida and I'll be on your show. Or we can talk on the phone, we can talk privately, we can talk in whatever manner you want. But anyone else who engaged with KB and Ameen's material and people who think like that and it just didn't seem right to you, if you found this helpful, do me a favor. Won't you like this? Won't you share it? Why don't you subscribe? And put a comment below. Tell me, even if you disagree with me, tell me what you disagree with. I'll be happy to engage with you because that's why I do this. Until next time, friends, God bless you. Peace out.